Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I had this guest on the air with us some time ago, and I really wanted to continue the conversation. This is Dr. Mark Hoipkemier. He is the author of The Price of the Common Good, Markets, Corporations, and Political Economy. It really is a brilliant book. It's a very systematic read that presents a good way of thinking about markets in light of not only what the church has taught, but also the application of natural law principles in the political economy. Mark, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for having me back. I appreciate the chance.
Well, I'm very, very glad to be able to speak with you. And so I want to begin once again, for those who did not catch our initial interview, to allow you to share this concept of the common good and the concept of the economy. Because there are a few problems that we immediately think of when modern man, devoid of the Christian worldview, thinks of the economy. Number one, we think of it as a zero-sum game, which is fallacious. But number two, that there really is a common good perspective that ought to be governing all of our economic processes. So let's begin there.
Yeah, good. Yeah, no, you're right that some people think of the economy, as you say, as merely a zero-sum game where everything that, the rich gain, the poor lose. If you've studied any economics, you know that that's not necessarily true. That you have win-win transactions, so both people can emerge better, both people are wealthier in the sense that they have more things that they need, et cetera. So the economy is not a zero-sum game. But if you take a typical economic view, even if you acknowledge that, what people generally still are going to think it's about is basically about private goods, meaning you end up wealthier and I end up wealthier. So you have more money or more stuff, and I have more money and more stuff. And that's good, which is, of course, that's not wrong. But if that's all you see, you're not seeing anything like what the church or the tradition would call a common good. A common good is always a shared good, and it's generally the good of some kind of community or some kind of relationship. So you'd have to point to the common good of a family or the common good of a business or a team or something like this, where people share more than just money in your account, money in mine. We also have good relationships. We're working well together. We have a culture that helps us to be better people or more productive or whatever. So if all we see is private goods, we're not seeing that. But really in the economy, of course, that is something that's essential, especially in businesses, but also in a more remote way in markets, that there are common goods, there are shared goods. And as long as we're only seeing money and the kind of thing that it shows up in the Economist textbook, we're not really seeing that. So the Catholic Church or the tradition really has something to add to what we think is going on in a good economy.
You highlight a crucial point that I'd like you to dive into, just so that our listeners really get the concept of not just what you're putting forth, but what the tradition has taught. And that is that at the end of the day, there is no private good that's strictly, completely, totally private. There's always some common aspect to even the most private of goods.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a number of different ways. I think that's a traditional position, and it's true. So, for example, what seems like the most private good, maybe money. It's really you take your money, I take my money. Where it came from, it doesn't really matter. It seems like the sort of thing that's just about me and my self-interest, me and my bank account. But if you think about it, money actually only exists within the context of a society. Someone has to be willing to accept your money in order for you to buy anything. Someone has to know what money means. There's questions about inflation and all sorts of sort of shared concerns that even allow me to use money, the most private good. And that's pretty much true of anything else as well. If you were my success as a football player or my success, I'm a professor as a professor, there's a background there of I'm contributing to, the popularity of the NFL or the health of football or, the university I'm part of or my discipline. So things that we normally think of as private goods and can be seen that way, at some point there's always a common good background in the sense of a community that is interested or that is involved. So yeah, we can never think of things strictly as private goods. Sometimes we can bracket those larger concerns, and that's okay. But if we really get to the root of things, a fully private good just isn't, there's no such thing.
I don't mean to throw any theorists under the bus, but you do wind up highlighting different theorists in your book, one of which is Hayek. And a lot of Hayek's work has to do with making some potentially hardline distinctions between private and common goods. How much has that influenced the way modern man thinks about the economy today?
I think, on one hand, Hayek was picking up on things that went before him, so he didn't cause all of this, but he's an exceptionally clear-minded theorist about these kinds of things. So this is why I really like reading Hayek. He draws a very clear distinction between private goods and common goods. He knows what they are, but he has a project of trying to say that common goods really don't matter, at least in the market. So he would say that because what's going on in a market is people responding to prices, they share no goods. And this is to a large extent true. I don't need to know why you're buying my shirt or what you're going to do with my website or my computer program. We don't have to share an end. As long as I'm willing to sell it, you're willing to buy it, and we'll both be better off. That's enough for the market. Now, Hayek makes another move, which is to say that if you were to say, well, what makes markets possible? Isn't there some, as I just mentioned, some kind of community background or some kind of politics that is there? And Hayek would say, well, maybe, but we can think of politics in just the same way as we think of the market as another kind of spontaneous order where people don't really need to share anything in common. They can just know what the rule of law is, know what property laws and contract rules are, and they go about their business. So this is a highly sort of like an ultra-liberal view of what politics or a political community is. It's just a bunch of people who have a set of rules for pursuing their own interests. So in that kind of a system, there would be no common good either. And I think he's pretty right to say if that's all there is, then people don't share common goods in politics any more than they share them in the economy. Now, he would be okay with there being common goods in your family or something like this. So he's not opposed to all that. But he thinks that's sort of not part of public life. It's really a private, you want to look at community goods privately, that's fine. So he tries to keep all considerations of common goods off the stage when it comes to political considerations or public debate.
Someone who's family to you, Al Cresta, my predecessor and mentor and spiritual father, he and I had numerous conversations about this, and what you're touching on really expands the conversation that I'd like to lean into. Al always said that whenever we're talking about social issues, whether it's economics or politics, it's easy for even Catholics to think in terms of categorical extremes because those are the categories given to us. Mm-hmm. So in economics, we hear the terms demand side, supply side, and they can sometimes be juxtaposed to a caricaturized extreme. Can you help us understand what these two terms are, but also what the tradition seems to have to say about thinking about economics rightly?
I think there's a danger, or there's a benefit to thinking in sort of black and white terms, is that you understand that things are different and you don't mix them up. So you can end up with mushy thinking when you think everything is the same. So in this case, what people would like to think, or what is a sort of a standard picture, would be the economy is all about private goods. It's just about money and private interest, and that's fine. And maybe if you don't go all the way as far as Hayek, you would say maybe politics or society or religion are about common goods, but we're going to keep those as far apart from the economy as we possibly can because they're just, as you say, they're kind of categorical extremes. The economy is about private goods. The rest of life, maybe politics, culture, society, about common goods. There's something right there insofar as the economy does lean towards or incline more towards private good thinking, contracts. It requires less of us, perhaps, than our families or than our communities do. Those require us to gauge more of ourselves. But to think that the economy only runs on the logic of private goods, only contract, only self-interest, that's a fantasy. So we need we need to be able to apply the common good thinking and common good concerns to an economy, just like we need to be able to apply private good concerns to politics. Yes, we do share some goods in politics or family, but people also have conflicting incentives. And so you need to be able to realize that these are different they're both shades of gray. One is more closer to black and one is closer to white, but neither of them is fully black or white.
And I greatly appreciate that because in chapter 5 of your book, The End of the Invisible Hand, you do a really good job of articulating this concept of market relations rightly and helping us understand man's role, that markets don't exist as an ethereal abstraction. It really is human beings participating in work with each other in relation. Help us set that paradigm.
Yeah, so I think the way to think about it, there isn't really such a thing as, or it's sometimes unhelpful to think of the market in a giant thing. What markets are is a web of relation, but it is a certain kind of relationship. And there's sort of a paradigm of what we mean when we mean, or at least I think we ought to mean when we say, I'm in a market relationship to you. And the dominant way of thinking about that, which is a little bit exaggerated, and is what I in the book call strangers selling stuff. So the idea that when we meet on the market, we meet more or less as strangers in the sense that we are not meeting as friends or as boss and employee. We sort of treat everyone exactly the same. And so we abstract from, I'll charge everyone the same price. I'll treat everyone with the same amount of respect. But, if you're my friend or maybe you're someone famous, I'm going to charge you the same price as somebody else because I'm trying to charge you what the just price for the thing is. But this way of treating people, there's nothing wrong with it. It's good. It's very beneficial. And the invisible hand is a real phenomenon. But this is itself a thing that we sort of have to have built. Humans have to learn how to do this. This isn't maybe the most natural thing to treat everyone as a stranger. I want to treat you as my friend instead of treating you with a certain amount of detachment.
We're going to continue on the other side of the break. I'm talking with Dr. Mark Hoipkemier, and we're just getting into the meat of the conversation. We're talking about his book, The Price of the Common Good, Markets, Corporations, and Political Economy. I sincerely, truly believe every Catholic ought to procure a copy of this, to read it, so that we can understand what adult functioning as Catholics in the market and for the sake of the common good looks like. Continuing on the other side. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Pete. I'm talking with Dr. Mark Hoipkemier. He is a professor at the University of Notre Dame. He is also the author of this amazing book, The Price of the Common Good, Markets, Corporations, and Political Economy. Mark, when we were hit with the break earlier, you were beginning to tell us about the concept of the invisible hand and how that can affect not just the paradigm, but then by virtue of that, the way we operate within the market. So please pick up where you left off.
Well, the idea of the invisible hand is basically that the market, via the price system and the other rules of the market, allow goods and services to get around a very large economy in an efficient, dynamic way, even though people don't know where they're going or they don't know how they're benefiting other people. And this is assuredly something good. I mean, this is one of the great sources of prosperity in the West over the last few hundred years, etc. So I don't think we should disparage the invisible hand at all. But what the invisible hand, because it causes, where it comes from is people treating each other with a certain amount of detachment or in a sort of impersonal way. When we rely on the invisible hand has trouble taking account of common goods as such, because people, when acting in a market, you treat someone kind of as a stranger, as I mentioned. Again, that means goods may move around, but common goods get kind of damaged because common goods require treating people as a fellow member, a fellow Catholic, a fellow family member, a fellow person from Michigan or from where, requiring reference to some shared community, and the invisible hand operates on a different logic. So it can be a very beneficial thing, and I wouldn't want to remove the dynamic of the invisible hand, but there's a tension with promoting the common good. I could take the money I make on the market and then invest it in my church or my community. Great. But the market itself seems to be pretty indifferent to all of those shared concerns.
Which then leads us to some of the results of those things that are invisible. A market order, for example, or whether we like it or not, when we're operating in different facets and subsets of the market, there are certain common ends that lead to ultimate larger common ends that hopefully finally point towards the grander common good.
Well, and I think that one of the sort of tricks or interesting things about the invisible hand is if we recognize that the market really does a good job of apportioning goods and services, of doing economic coordination, we have to back off a little bit about saying we want everything to be a common good in a strong sense. Because in the strongest sense, I would know what the common good is. I know what we share as members of the church or of a family. But the invisible hand sort of puts a certain kind of veil between us and the good that it does. And so you have to be willing to say, I think this is part of the ethos of the market, be willing to say, I'm not sure what good I am doing or where this is ultimately going. I have to trust other people who are out there. So that, I think, is just part of this complex picture that I want to benefit the common good, and part of that involves me saying, I'm just going to let you, people on the market pursue your own purposes, even though these are invisible to me. That requires a kind of discipline.
What about the people who operate within the market that don't have a concept of the common good at all, especially when we're talking about key players within either global or national economics?
Right. I mean, I think actually the standard way or role that people occupy in the market, if you think of just an ordinary buyer or seller, people don't really think about the common good, or in part because it's hard to know what it requires of them other than just buying and selling according to their lights, according to their self-interest. Adam Smith has a famous comment, which I think is often helpful. He says it doesn't do much good for people to think about the common good, or for businessmen or merchants to think about the common good, because they don't really know what it requires. It's such a big thing. Better to let the invisible hand take care of that. Now, and I think that's often the right answer. On the other hand, there are some players, as you say, maybe some key players. Now, these could be big corporations that have a certain market-making power. These could be regulators or citizens or government officials. They might need to think in a somewhat different way. They can't completely trust the logic of the invisible hand because they have a certain ability to shape the whole outcome of the thing in a way that me, just as a normal guy, doesn't. So they might need to think a little bit more about the common good and not just assume, the invisible hand will help everything work out well.
There's this great book that I was blessed to have read recently. It's called Why Democracy Needs the Rich, and it actually touches on this concept in chapter 5 of your book about the inevitability of common good thinking, even if it's completely subconscious. And so I want to invite you to speak to that.
Well, to me, the concept of some people say the concept of the common good is sort of in danger given modernity, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't have any worries about it because it really refers to a certain human reality, the reality of being and acting together, that's not going to go anywhere. I think common good is appropriate wherever people are acting together in some kind of social form or group. And so as long as that's the case, mere market thinking or total invisible hand thinking is just going to prove inadequate. So if you're trying to make decisions as a businessman about your business, not just about what you should buy and sell, but who you should hire, product lines, et cetera, and how you should treat the people around you, the invisible hand type thinking is just going to turn out too thin, and people are going to end up thinking in what I would call common good ways, because it just responds to the actual reality of dealing with people in an organization or a group.
Which creates that tension that you highlight too between market efficiency versus the concept of moral markets or morality within markets. No human being can really escape those concepts. I invite you to speak into that tension and help us understand it better.
Yeah, I think, there's a theoretically motivated attempt by some people who really love markets to think all we ever need is market thinking or market logic. All we ever need is contracts. And that turns out to be a terrible way to run a business. It turns out to be a terrible way to run lots of kinds of things. Again, the logic of the market is highly beneficial. It's good. We can affirm it, but it's not everything we need. And so, and that's obviously the case in a business firm, because you can't the market won't tell you who to fire and how to treat people. You have to figure that out for yourself, and that's gonna involve that you think about things that you share with your employees, with your boss, etc. But also, even if you're just thinking about prices and markets in the more strict sense, markets have a major effect on the way that we live together. So it's the invisible hand, or the prevalence of a market doesn't just mean the GDP is higher or my salary is higher, I have more stuff. It also means we have a way of thinking about one another, about thinking about ourselves that becomes kind of habitual. And so if our markets are totally ignorant or indifferent to that kind of thing, we're going to end up thinking of ourselves just as people who are maximizing our social capital or return on investment. We start using these categories that come from the world of the market and are okay there, but in places that they don't belong. And so it helps to be able to think about markets as also a kind of moral order or moral instrument that itself has an ethical dimension, so that we don't forget about ourselves and about others, that there's something more going on than just GDP or private goods.
And therefore you rightly highlight that as it's helpful to think about markets in these ethical categories, even if not explicitly all the time, we also want to shy away from thinking that the market by itself is a completely autonomous thing. And I also want to invite you to speak to, we are in an era of human civilization that we've hitherto never seen in terms of the global diversification of labor, but also diversification of commerce, and just digital overrun of how markets are operating today. In light of all of this, it's easy to think, the markets are just, they're autonomous, they're operating. So, just speak to that, please.
Yeah, there's, and here I've drawn a thinker named Karl Polanyi, who I might have mentioned before in our previous interview, but he's one of the best thinkers about helping us think of markets, as you say, as non-autonomous. He points out that there's a certain view of markets that people would like to say the market simply exists on its own, it has its own logic, it will seek the invisible hand or seek economic efficiency if we just let it do its thing. That's not 100% wrong, but markets don't spring out of nothing. They're intimately connected with the way that we live together in other places and other facets of our lives, in part because markets are not, for the most part still, thankfully, not conducted by machines who only look at prices, but by people who want to be treated well, who have an idea about what they're there for, and who can't bracket all their concerns as family members, as members of a certain country, etc. And so it turns out that markets are just one aspect of human life, and so one obvious way that this is the case is that one major concern of politics is the regulation of the market. Likewise, markets have a major impact on politics. Who gets elected, who doesn't get elected, has a good deal to do with is the economy going well, etc. I mean, that's a fairly basic type example. But also what markets are not, they depend on, say, what communications technology we have. Can I contract with somebody in Mongolia or in Tanzania or not? Can I even understand those people? So culture, technology, these affect how markets work, and likewise markets have an effect on them. So if we think that markets just have they're just off in their own separate world, I think we're going to miss a good deal of the picture about what makes a good market and how markets work in the first place.
Which goes back to something you were pointing out earlier, the concept of social contracts. And contracts are good, and they govern most, if not all, of market operation. No, most, the vast majority of market operations. But you also highlight how there is an implicit drive for the concept of ethical and virtuous exchange. And so, once again, we see realities held in a healthy tension.
Yeah, I think some people who criticize markets think markets are amoral. To me, that's impossible for a market to be fully amoral, and because the basic rule of the market is something like, pay the price that you promised to pay, which is keep your promises is a moral imperative. So to have any markets at all, you have to have some kind of morality, but the normal morality of the market, so to speak, is very thin. It just says, don't treat people terribly, but otherwise you can try, you don't need to think about too much, but you just keep your promises and respect their contracts and their property, etc. So, but it's worth thinking about when we make a market contract. Again, what are some of the further dimensions that this contract might affect? So my profession, for example, or my region, my family, other sorts of, as I say, common goods. They might be affected. Now, oftentimes it's hard to know what the answer would be there, so we should just keep our promises and pay the market price and sort of deal in a kind of ordinary way. But we should also recognize that in many markets there is the possibility of a richer relationship to what we share in common, especially, Polanyi would say this, when we're dealing with things like, say, land. So land is something that, there's a real estate market, you can buy and sell it. But if somebody buys all the land in an area, it's really going to affect the local community. And what they decide to do with that land is going to affect the local community in a way that what they decide to do with piles of widgets in a warehouse is not. So land has more of a sort of a shared concern aspect to it. And so when a good contract or a good market exchange around land is going to invoke something about how we want to live together in the relevant people who are connected to this land or who see it or deal with it.
Oh. Mark, once again, the time just flew by. Thank you so very much for making the time to speak with me. My guest has been Dr. Mark Hoipkemier. He's the author of The Price of the Common Good, published by Notre Press. Please do procure a copy of this and engage Mark. Get in touch with him and find out more about his work. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.